IVM.
Walmart buys Flipkart.
Trump out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Trump bats for a North Korea nuclear deal.
We take you deep into the news from India and around the world in this roundup episode of the Pragati podcast.
Welcome to the Pragati podcast, a weekly talk show on economics, public policy, and international relations.
We are your hosts, Hamsini, Hariharan,
and Pavan, Srinath. Walmart finally enters India in a meaningful way by spending $16 billion to acquire Flipkart. We dissect what this means for foreign businesses trying to enter India.
The American president, Donald Trump, withdrew the US from the Iran nuclear deal while at the same time batting for a nuclear deal with Korea. We tried to figure out what this means for India, our own nuclear weapons and foreign policy.
We also tried to take a look at what this means for countries owning and possessing a nuclear weapon. Stay tuned and we'll be right back after this.
Shunyawan, 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 Shunyawan.
$1 billion acquisition. Another copycat startup got formed.
No, the tech world in India is surely moving double the speed of this voiceover.
Tune in to Shunya One every Tuesday to catch us talking to the smartest people we know on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
And we're back. So, Pavan, the last week has been filled with news reports about Walmart taking over Flipkart, about them entering the country. I thought they weren't allowed to do that. Break all of this down for me.
Okay, so there is no special taboo against Walmart entering India, but they've been trying to do this for a while. So Walmart spent $16 billion in acquiring Flipkart. That's over 100,000 crore rupees. And this is a long saga in which Walmart is finally entering the country in a meaningful way. They started off about a decade ago with a joint venture with Bharti.
Okay.
And the joint venture was necessary because we did not allow foreign direct investment into retail beyond, I think, 49% or so. So they entered this, but even then they could not operate where they could sell directly to customers. So they started like a business-to-business wholesale company.
Okay.
So, Metro Cash and Carry in Bangalore?
Yeah.
So you need to have like a company ID and you need to be some form of an employee of a company and then you can go buy it. You can't buy it personally and so on. And so basically Walmart could only do that. So they set up, I think, a whole bunch of these supercenter type things across the country. But after a few years, the joint venture was dissolved. Bharti moved away. They tried to do something on their own. Clearly, there was not much potential and things were not working out. So Walmart, before they bought Flipkart, were, I think, running about 20 such business-to-business sort of cash and carry type outlets. And so this was a big limitation, So why I'm interested in this story is Walmart's been trying to enter India for a long time. And Walmart has successfully entered a lot of other countries, but had similar problems elsewhere too. In Germany also there were severe restrictions and they could not become a big player there.
So what
they
are
entered
the
Mexico. I'll come to that. They entered Mexico, but then they got embroiled in some very bad bribery and corruption allegations where they were trying to get their way through licenses and so on. And Walmart was along with perhaps Monsanto, were sort of the symbols of big corporate evil that people saw in India, right? I mean, I'm sure there's Wall Street and financial sector, but as far as real sector companies were concerned, Walmart was up there. Right. And so there was this general discontent. So anytime the foreign direct investment discussion took place, Walmart was the reference point. And the idea is that Walmart can come and compete with India's retail sector, right? India's retail sector is horribly non-organized. I think 90% of the sector is informal. Of the 10% which is formal and organized, maybe 10% of that is e-commerce. So that's really what India's retail economy looks like.
And as far as I remember about this, the narrative went that if you let Walmart in, then all your small kiranas and your small shops will go out of business and all these people would be out of jobs and all of that.
Right. So the thing is that right now, India's markets don't work well. One of the principal problems is an extremely high transaction cost. So if a farmer gets 4 rupees a kilo for potatoes that he sells, that comes to Bangalore at say 40 rupees a kilo, which means that, you know, anywhere between 75 and even 90% of the value of that potato is captured by the supply chain, right? So it's not that the middlemen in the supply chain are evil and just taking money and stuff. It's that you don't have businesses which can operate across their length. Right, so Walmart is able to source things directly from farmers abroad, you know, get them from wherever they're grown to wherever they need to be sold, have cold chain technologies where you can store and refrigerate it. I mean, we waste 40% of fruits and vegetables in India. So we desperately need somebody to invest a lot of money in improving infrastructure.
So
and not all of this is public.
So what's the problem if Walmart does invest that much money? They have it, they want to invest.
The concern is that if they do it, then they'll be so competitive that your mom and pop stores will disappear. Right, which is always a tall claim for India, because we had this thing when KFC was trying to come into India that, oh, you know, these guys are going to take over.
Vada pav sellers out of business.
Yeah, so the thing is, KFC came to India, McDonald's came to India, and they came in not as the least expensive options, which they are in the US, but as, you know, something decent. Right? I mean, something mid-tier. So even when Walmart comes to India, it will be interesting to see how it will position itself, you know, if it were to come in the traditional manner. But this was a big problem. A lot of entrenched interests were threatened. And some of the politics of India never allowed it. So during the UPA regime, we have seen a lot of back and forth on FDI in single brand retail, multi-brand retail. There were other regulations that were tacked on to this. So even if you could do multi-brand retail, like I said, 30% has to be sourced from small businesses. There were labor restrictions, all kinds of restrictions, apart from actually land and, you know, buying their centers and so on. So not just that, but even our agricultural rules have not been sufficiently relaxed in many states. It's only in a few states now that you can do things like contract farming. For example, Walmart wants to sell potatoes and onions. And it wants a good quality of these potatoes and onions. So they can enter into a contract with farmers in, I don't know, Arsikere in Karnataka and say that, look, we have a deal, you grow this much, I will give you this much of a rate. And you can pre-decide that, and that can give more security to that farmer if it's, you know, negotiated well. But such practices were not allowed in the country for a long time. Now, slowly, states have started liberalizing. So one is just the investment part. So even there, it's not yet automatic. You have the Foreign Investment Promotion Board, FIPB, which has to approve these things. It's very different from, you know, Google trying to come into India, right? Because if you're investing in software, it's very easy. Software is one of the most liberalized sectors in the country, which is why Flipkart is an online marketplace, which is a software company, and that can receive full foreign direct investment.
So what you're saying is that Walmart has circumvented all these rules by purely investing in Flipkart.
I mean, they've had to jump around them to try a different path to enter India. Right? The regular doors were closed. And this is what, right? So you have Walmart, which is a big company with all this power, trying to enter India and failing. But at the same time, Amazon comes to India a few years ago and is able to successfully launch. And Amazon India is doing quite well. They're still not the market leader. Flipkart, I think, has about, if I'm not mistaken, 39% of the e-commerce market, including, you know, Myntra, Jabong, and so on. And I think Amazon India has maybe 29%, right? So they're still not a market leader, but they're doing well. And they got into India very quickly. Right, so the weight was not as much. So I think it tells a story of how businesses that are disrupting traditional businesses in the US might have a better chance of succeeding in India, even if India is at a previous level.
Like Uber.
Yeah. So I hate to use the term leapfrogging, but
why?
You know, because I think it's overused and overplayed. Oh, India leapfrogged the manufacturing sector to start services. I mean, I don't buy that. I think we just failed at manufacturing. But, we did move from no telephones to cell phones, right? We didn't have no telephones, all landlines, and then cell phones. And similarly, retail is usually an organized sector, small businesses, large businesses, then e-commerce. And we seem to be skipping that step. Like what we have in India, I think, Big Bazaar is one. You have Total Mall. We have a few, but not at the scale that India needs. Right. So now that Walmart has bought Flipkart, it'll be interesting to see how they do e-commerce and perhaps traditional big business commerce. And you see the similar story with Uber as well, where conventionally you had few public transport options behind buses and trains and so on, moving to something like auto rickshaw, something informal, to, a fleet of taxis, to Uber and Ola. And India largely skipped that fleet of taxis part. Except for Mumbai, few other Indian cities have had a large scale of taxis operating. Right? We've had auto rickshaws. Bangalore is, there's an apocryphal story about how in the 70s the auto rickshaw lobby got in a rule saying that flag down taxis are illegal in Bangalore. Right? Like a taxi that you can flag on the road. And it needed Uber to come into the city. It needed Ola to come into the city in order to disrupt that. Right? So it tells us that you really need to have that cutting edge technology, cutting edge business model in order to come into the country and operate. All including operating the politics of the country. I mean, think about this, right? So you have this small electronic store or a small supermarket, which is operating in the city, and you have, say, Walmart, which comes in. Walmart will be directly competing with this business, right? Taking business away from them. However, if, say, Amazon comes in or another e-commerce company comes in, these same companies can start selling on Amazon. Your supermarket can link itself to Big Basket or Amazon Now or somewhere else and sell their goods. So you don't see this new business as competition, but also as a new business opportunity, right? Even with Uber, yes, there were auto rickshaws which were losing businesses, but drivers are fungible. So a lot of drivers shifted over, and so the drivers did not become an entrenched opposition to this idea. Right? I think that's a very key thing to look at. If you have very clear losers who are powerful, who might lose out on the status quo, then India is still a place where they can put up a very vehement opposition. But if you can win them over to your side, and if your business model allows that, then I think you can do very well in the country.
All right.
So that's what's happening at home. But Hamsini, walk us through what's happening abroad. We have US President Trump doing interesting things as usual.
As usual. So the US President Trump kept up to his promises that he made in the elections, saying that he was going to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration had signed in 2015. And he announced last week that he would. And this is not surprising, considering that he's been saying that he was going to do it over and over again. But what the Iran nuclear deal did is that it basically softened all the sanctions that the US and EU countries and companies had levied with Iran for a very long time. So Iran, one of the reasons it signed the deal was because it said that it would tone down the work that it was doing in its nuclear program if the US would ease sanctions.
Right. So that Iran could properly enter the global economy again.
Yes. And what this has essentially done is that the US sanctions could still apply to companies all over the world. And, there's a lot of, we don't know what the fine print is going on. But this is significantly going to impact us in three ways. So I'm going to get to the first two before I get to the obvious nuclear part of it. But the first is oil. It's very easy to see that oil prices have gone up, will go up again. And compared to how this was 3 years ago, when our current government came into power, oil prices were at rock bottom. So this is going up again. So it depends on how India and Iran can negotiate their own oil deals, because remember that Iran is still the third largest supplier of oil to India. So
That's been very interesting, right? You had the US impose sanctions a few years ago, and India was very heavily dependent on Iran. As the Iran sanctions came into place, India started ramping up its imports from Iraq, downplayed Iran.
Which is why Iraq is now our largest exporter of oil.
Once Iran got out of the sanctions, it started sort of climbing again.
Exactly. And now what people are also noticing is we've done this before. We've dealt with US sanctions in the 2000s before. So our economy is more prepared, and the SOPs are already laid out. We know what to do.
Right.
And
But what I find sad is that the US, when it lifted its sanctions, was actually reversing 40 years of policy towards Iran. After the Ayatollah took over Iran, you had a complete break of ties. You had all kinds of things go wrong. And if you think about it, Iran is perhaps a natural ally of the United States, or at least their interests are aligned in a lot of things.
You would think so, but it's surprising what a single tweet can do to the world.
Right.
The second thing that this is done is the Chabahar port. So the Chabahar port is important because we've been talking about this for the last 2-3 years, but it's important for us because 80% of Afghanistan's trade that was generally going through Karachi has shifted to Iran's ports. And the people who were primarily driving for this were India and the US. And so with US reimposing sanctions, we don't know what it will mean for the deal with Chabahar port, because in February, when the Iran president visited India, when Rouhani visited India, he said he was going to transfer Chabahar port to India for a period of 18 months. So now the Indian strategists have to figure out how not to let the current US sanctions get in the way of what we're doing in Chabahar, because it's important for us in Central Asia. Right.
And frankly, having Afghanistan-Iran transit be effective actually would make sense for the rest of American foreign policy too, right? Because they're trying to crack down on Pakistan. And if you cut off Iran, then you have to use Pakistani supply routes and the Khyber Pass again.
Yeah.
And the entire length of that is a wonderful rent-seeking opportunity for the state of Pakistan.
That's true. So those are two effects that we've seen. But the largest is the nuclear aspect of it. Because as someone who's considered de facto nuclear power ourselves, what's happening in Iran is very interesting, because in the same tweet that he said, we're pulling out of the Iran deal, President Trump also said, I'm going to send my Secretary of State to North Korea. We've decided the dates on which we're meeting and all of that.
And the North Korea deal is strikingly similar to the one offered to Iran earlier, right?
Yes.
The United States will invest in the economic development of North Korea in exchange for it toning down its nuclear program.
True, and there's no reason for North Korea to agree for such a deal, right? Because if you just look at patterns of behavior, the US hasn't proved very reliable in that sense.
But and this comes to the point I wanted to make on this topic. Maybe it does make sense for North Korea, because they already have the bomb.
If they didn't have the bomb, then
it wouldn't have made sense at all, because that would put it in an Iran situation. I think what Trump is doing is illustrating to the world that if you have a nuclear weapon, you are in a different league on the global stage. And this is historically significant and poignant right now, because we are also on the anniversary of the Pokhran nuclear tests.
Yes.
Right? India and where it is today, the discussions that we are having and the stature it is able to command right now is simply because of possessing a nuclear weapon. Right? The US-India 1-2-3 deal may not have happened if India was not a nuclear power.
Completely agree. And this also goes on to prove that the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that everyone's been harping on for the last 70 odd years simply hasn't worked. Because it's been focusing on non-proliferation. There's a lot been said about world peace and disarmament. If you remember, Barack Obama got the Nobel Prize for his speech on non-proliferation. And none of that matters in the larger thing. The only insurance you have in an anarchical world is a deterrent, a good, plausible deterrent, which in this case is nuclear weapons.
And I think the actions of non-proliferation agents has actually been very illustrative of why you should not follow that path. Right?
Yeah.
The people who gave up nuclear weapons in favor of something from the United States or NATO have all suffered.
True.
Right? Gaddafi gave up nuclear weapons. Look what's happened to him. All of Libya is in chaos. And clearly Iran is also getting screwed over. And there is no reason for North Korea to ever give up its nuclear weapons. And it can say that now we won't test or we won't do something.
Yeah, sure. But, and I think the difference in the North Korean case is, if you've seen, President Kim has gone in to China twice since Trump announced that he was going to be meeting him in May or June or whenever. Which is another interesting way to see it. I think the difference with North Korea is that they have a overt backer, which Iran or none of the other countries at that point in time had.
That's true. Probably even Pakistan's nuclear weapons program was blessed by China.
Pakistan's nuclear weapons program was blessed by a lot of people. But never in this overt a manner has a country come out and sort of signaled support.
Fair enough. Iran does not have a backer the way North Korea does with China. But you can argue that once you have acquired your nuclear weapons, you don't need to rely on a backer to be able to hold the United States or any other power off.
Fair. But going back to sanctions, right? I think the most important thing for India is to figure out a way to buck these sanctions, because Iran's national interests align with India's. Iran's national interests align with the US's for a major part.
And even if they don't, it's in our interest to have a globally engaged Iran.
Exactly. For a variety of reasons that we just spoke about. But I'm going to move to another part of Central and South Asia, Afghanistan. So last week, 7 engineers who were working in a power plant that was headed by the Goenka group and an Afghan firm were abducted. We don't know who abducted them. And so the Ministry of External Affairs said, we're in talk with the relevant authorities. We're trying to get tribal village elders to help us and so on and so forth. But what this brought to mind was last month, Sushma Swaraj admitted in front of the parliament that 40 workers who were suspected to be killed in 2014 were confirmed to be dead. So just to give you a little context of this statement from last month is that in 2014 in Mosul, when the Islamic State was at its peak, 40 workers, Indian workers, were abducted. And for a very long time, the Ministry of External Affairs said, we have gotten intimations that they're alive, we're in talks, we're negotiating the release of them so that they can come back to their families. And, post that, 4 years from then, it came out that they were dead, had been dead for a very long time, and there was evidence that they had been that way. And there was a lot of criticism, not only from the families of these workers who'd gone abroad, but also from civil society. Because what it seemed to suggest that Indian foreign policy was exceptional in bringing back these 40 people who were abducted, whereas other countries had completely failed, and that would be the strength of Indian foreign policy. So that policy position was problematic. And that is why I thought this case was also interesting. The difference, however, is that there's a lot in Indian policy drawn between legal and illegal migrants, and clearly in Afghanistan they're not migrants at all, and they were, contracted on behalf of India to work on that project. But it's an interesting comparison to see what happens to Indian people when they are abroad, and how the government of India seems a little powerless to safeguard them beyond its own territory.
Right. And I think the challenge now is, if India has declared that it will take more care of its citizens abroad in various conditions, then it has to deliver on that promise. Mr. Modi has repeatedly said that not just to Indian citizens who happen to be working abroad, but also to the extended Indian community, which includes, people of Indian origin. So that's a big responsibility to take on and to deliver on.
Yeah, and we hear about the other side of this, right? We hear about Indian evacuations from Oman or Yemen or whatever, and how they evacuated, European nationals from there, Bangladeshis and so on. And, there was this idea that India was carrying out a duty for not only itself, but its entire world. But I think there are other parts of the story that we don't see. And I think that's also an
Right.
important
No,
point.
and what India did is truly commendable, and it needs to be encouraged, and we need to do more of it. But it's just we can't sort of claim that we can secure the safety of Indian workers, often, who might have left the country under suspicious circumstances or through dubious means. It's very difficult to secure their safety, especially in ISIS-controlled territories and so on.
Fair enough. And another thing about a lot of these migrant workers is also that the government of India often says, these are irregular workers, meaning that they didn't go through contractors or agents who the government of India has specified. But often how this works is, you have an uncle working somewhere and he says, oh, if you come, I can give you...
No, and you also have a
whatever.
network, right?
Yeah.
There was recently a case of how a number of Nepali people were also similarly trapped somewhere. And there is a large network, just like you have a Hawala network, you have a network of companies and agents who sort of even take out ads and hire workers here. Often there is mis-selling. Their passports are taken away a lot of
Bonded
the time.
labor is still...
Right? So it's a trying thing. But India's response to that has been things like ECNR. Right, immigration
What's the
check not required,
Oh, okay.
right? So that, if you don't have a degree or if you have not crossed class 10 and if you're trying to leave the country, you need that stamp on your passport, otherwise you won't be allowed to leave. So our mechanisms for managing labor movement out of the country have been very, very primitive.
Yeah, and they tried the thing with the different colored passports recently.
Yeah, that was
as
the
well.
fracas, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we have
yeah.
not tried to do anything meaningful to secure Indians abroad in a systemic way, but only a few checks like this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hamsini. I think that about wraps up this episode. Do you have any reading recommendations for our listeners?
Yes, particularly on Iran-India ties, I think there are two pieces that people could look to. One is something that Rohan Joshi wrote on Pragati called Rocking the Kasbah, where he talks about these implications of what the US sanctions do. And the other is a piece by Tanvi Madan for Brookings Institution. So if you go to thinkpragati.com, you'll be able to find Rohan Joshi's piece over there. What about you, Pavan? What have you been reading?
I'd actually go back to a piece of research that we came out with at Takshashila by Guru Iyer on sort of assessing the capacity needed for India to evacuate a large number of its citizens across the world. What kind of military assets would we need? I mean, you need a lot of planes, you'll need ships, you'll need other kinds of things. And what kind of capacities would we need for what kind of swiftness in our response?
All right, that's the show this week. Thanks for staying till the end.
If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com and we'll answer your questions in a future episode.
Get over to thinkpragati.com to read about how India is engaging the world. You can subscribe to the Pragati podcast on the IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We're there everywhere.
The Pragati podcast is an IVM production, and if you like our show, you can also check out their other shows like Cyrus Says, a show hosted by funny man Cyrus Brocha, where he chats with people that come from various walks of life about politics, traffic, food, and just about anything and everything. New episodes on Mondays and Thursdays on ivmpodcast.com, the IVM podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts.
He bends down to test the warm water for his bath. He comes here to quench his thirst for a hot shower and some podcasts. You can witness how he enjoys having other people talk about cool stuff in his bathroom. Indeed, it helps him with his loneliness. You can find more of his pieces on ivmpodcast.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.